There's a moment, almost imperceptible, when you decide to stop feeding your desires, and something inside you begins to scream. It's not your body that rebels first. It's your mind. The silence that follows the absence of pleasure becomes deafening. It's as if the soul has been unplugged from the world, and every nerve begins to question its own existence. You think abstinence is about control, about morality, about being stronger. No, it's about shock. The shock of realizing how dependent you've been on stimulation to feel alive. The shock of discovering that behind every pleasure there was an emptiness waiting to be filled. You don't meet peace at first. You meet the monster that pleasure kept asleep. When you stop indulging, your mind begins to tremble with the echoes of all the desires you've buried. Every fantasy, every urge, every unexpressed emotion surfaces. It feels unbearable. And that's exactly where transformation begins. Because now you are seeing what you truly are when nothing distracts you. This is not a denial of sexuality. It's the unveiling of it. Sexual energy is not sin, it's raw life itself. But when it's constantly spent outward, it enslaves you. When you withhold it consciously, it begins to climb upward. Into thought, into vision, into creation. The same force that once pulled you into flesh now pushes you toward transcendence. Abstinence is not purity. It is power under observation. You begin to sense that your desires are messages, not masters. You see how your impulses are mirrors of your wounds, your longings for connection, your search for meaning disguised as lust. And when you face that, when you endure the shock long enough, you begin to feel something astonishing. A quiet fire awakens. Your mind grows sharper. Your presence deepens. Your eyes start to see the world not through craving, but through clarity. What no one tells you is that abstinence doesn't kill your sexuality. It resurrects it in a higher form. It turns need into energy, obsession into art, loneliness into wisdom. The same current that once demanded release now fuels your will, your purpose, your very being. It's not about becoming less human. It's about becoming more whole. The shock of abstinence is the psyche remembering its own power, its own depth. It is the first step toward reclaiming the fire that you once mistook for mere pleasure, but was, all along, the essence of your soul trying to wake up. When we speak of sexual abstinence, most people think of it merely as a denial, a refusal of the body's natural call, a moral choice or a discipline of restraint. But this view is painfully shallow. Abstinence is not about denial. It is about transformation. Sexual energy, when not released outwardly, does not vanish. It turns inward. It begins to move through the corridors of the psyche, pressing against walls that most of us have never dared to explore. And in this process, something extraordinary happens. What was once purely physical becomes psychological, creative, and even spiritual. Human desire is not limited to the act of sex. It is the pulse of life itself. The same current that drives one to seek union with another also fuels art, discovery, and spiritual longing. When this current is constantly expended through indulgence, it dissipates like heat lost in the air, momentarily satisfying, but soon forgotten. Yet when it is withheld, consciously and intelligently, it begins to accumulate. It builds pressure, intensity, a kind of inner fire. The average mind perceives this as restlessness, frustration, or even suffering. But the wise recognize it as raw energy waiting to be transmuted. Most people cannot bear this intensity. They confuse it with anxiety or repression because they have never learned to hold it. We live in a culture obsessed with immediate relief. Pleasure has become the modern anesthetic against meaninglessness. Whenever the faintest shadow of desire arises, we rush to satisfy it, to silence it. But desire unspent becomes a mirror. It reflects what lies beneath: our loneliness, our fears, our longing to feel connected, not just to another person but to existence itself. When we abstain, that mirror no longer cracks under indulgence. It confronts us with an image of who we really are, without the distractions of gratification. This is where transformation begins. Because abstinence at its essence is not suppression, it is confrontation. It forces us to meet the raw material of our instincts without acting them out. It is the psychological equivalent of holding a flame in your hands without letting it burn you. The energy remains alive, potent, and conscious, rather than lost in the unconscious repetition of pleasure and release. There is a kind of alchemy at work here. The ancient mystics called it sublimation, the process by which base instincts are refined into higher forms of consciousness. When sexual energy is not expelled, it begins to seek new channels. It moves into imagination, into intuition, into creativity. The poet begins to write with an intensity that feels almost erotic. The thinker starts to see patterns that pulse with life. The artist feels the same current that once sought the flesh, now moving his brush, his words, his sound. It is the same energy, but its form has changed. Yet this transformation does not come easily. The first stage is almost always chaos. The mind rebels, the body protests. You may feel anger, irritation, confusion. These are the echoes of the old self, trying to reclaim its habitual comfort. To move beyond them, one must learn to observe rather than indulge. This requires an inner stillness that few possess today, a patience to let the storm pass without reacting. Because what follows that storm is not emptiness, but a profound clarity. Think of it like a seed buried in the soil. When it is not given immediate sunlight, it grows roots instead. It digs deeper into the darkness until it finds nourishment where none seem to exist. That is what happens when sexual energy is contained. It begins to root itself in the deeper layers of your psyche, drawing strength and wisdom from places you never knew existed. It becomes the foundation for something far greater than pleasure, authentic power. Power in this sense is not dominance or control over others. It is sovereignty over oneself. It is the ability to feel desire without being enslaved by it, to channel instinct without being consumed by it. The individual who has learned to hold his or her energy becomes magnetic. Their presence carries weight. Their words strike deeper. Their eyes reveal a stillness that cannot be faked. This is not because they are pure, but because they are integrated. They have met their desires, faced them, and learned to harness them rather than run from them. This process is deeply psychological. Every unexpressed impulse, every unmet longing becomes a symbol in the unconscious. When you abstain, these symbols begin to speak. You start to dream differently. You start to think differently. You begin to sense that sexual energy is not a narrow function of the body. It is the language of the soul seeking unity. Sometimes it seeks union with another human being, sometimes with beauty, truth, or God. The object changes, but the impulse remains the same, the search for wholeness. If you listen closely, you will notice that abstinence makes you more sensitive, not less. You begin to feel more deeply, think more clearly, perceive more sharply. This is because energy that once flowed outward now circulates inward. It sharpens awareness. It heightens perception. It awakens dormant faculties of intuition and insight. The energy that once sought escape through pleasure now begins to illuminate the dark corners of your mind. But let me be clear, abstinence is not the goal. Transformation is. The act of withholding pleasure without awareness leads only to repression and bitterness. But when done consciously, abstinence becomes a ritual of integration, a dialogue between the body and the soul. It is not about silencing desire. It is about listening to what desire is truly saying beneath its surface call. And when you hear that message, you realize that sexual energy was never your enemy. It was your teacher. It was trying in its own primal language to guide you back to your source. So when you feel the shock of abstinence, the restlessness, the ache, the hunger, do not run from it. Sit with it. Let it burn through the illusions that pleasure built around your heart. Because in that fire you will find not emptiness but transformation. There is a kind of shock that occurs when you stop feeding your desires, an inner tremor that runs deeper than the physical. It's not simply the absence of stimulation. It's the sudden confrontation with yourself. When the familiar rhythm of indulgence stops, the psyche begins to vibrate with an unfamiliar frequency, like a room once filled with noise, now echoing in silence. Most people mistake this silence for peace, but it isn't peace, it's exposure. Abstinence, in its first impact, is psychological nakedness. You begin to see everything that pleasure once concealed. In the beginning, you may think the discomfort you feel comes from the lack of release, from the body's protest. But that's only the surface. The real tremor happens deeper, in the mind's uneasy relationship with itself. You start to sense how much of your daily confidence, your mood, even your self-worth, was unconsciously attached to the idea of sexual satisfaction. You realize how much you relied on pleasure to escape the tension of existence. When you take that away, what's left is not peace but the raw, unmediated presence of your inner world, a world you may not have looked at in years. This is the shock no one warns you about. Abstinence strips away your illusions. It dismantles the comfortable narratives you've built around your desires. You begin to see that much of what you called freedom was actually dependence. Dependence on stimulation, on validation, on the constant reassurance that you are wanted, alive, relevant. Without it, the ego feels abandoned. It panics like a child whose toy has been taken away. That panic is not the body's cry, it's the ego's fear of insignificance. And yet this is precisely why abstinence is so powerful. It reveals to you with painful honesty where your attachments lie. It uncovers the architecture of your psyche, the patterns of avoidance, the subtle manipulations of desire, the emotional bargains you've made with yourself. You begin to witness your hunger, not just as physical but as existential. You see that beneath every urge for pleasure lies a yearning for connection, and beneath that, a longing to be whole. The shock comes from realizing how far you've drifted from that wholeness. Sexual indulgence, repeated unconsciously, can become a cycle of forgetting, a way to drown out the deeper ache for meaning. When you stop, that ache returns with full force. It can feel unbearable, as though you've opened a door to something vast and ancient within you. But that intensity is not punishment. It's revelation. It's life reclaiming its depth. When pleasure ceases to numb you, pain becomes articulate. It begins to speak in the language of symbols, dreams, and intuitions. You start to see that your desires have never been random. They are coded messages from the unconscious, guiding you toward integration. But we've been taught to silence those messages by gratifying them too quickly. We satisfy the surface and ignore the source. Abstinence reverses this. It forces you to stay with the message, to endure the discomfort long enough to understand what it truly means. At this stage, many people run. They interpret the chaos as failure, as if the goal was serenity. But serenity is not the beginning. It is the reward of endurance. The chaos is the necessary unveiling of what has been repressed. Think of it as the psyche's detoxification. Every suppressed emotion, every unmet need, every forgotten pain rises to the surface. The mind floods with old memories, strange dreams, and raw emotion. This is the soul's way of cleansing itself, once the narcotic of pleasure is withdrawn. If you can hold through that storm, you begin to notice something extraordinary. The very same energy that once overwhelmed you begins to reorganize itself. The tension that felt unbearable becomes vitality. The craving that once dominated your thoughts transforms into focus, alertness, even creativity. You realize that energy has not left you, it has changed form. The shock has burned away the layers of unconsciousness that dulled your awareness, leaving behind a sharper, more vibrant sense of being. Abstinence, then, is not a withdrawal from life. It is an intensification of it. It is life turning inward to rediscover its own strength. When you no longer need the world to constantly affirm your existence, something inside you stabilizes. You become less reactive, more observant. You begin to see that desire, in its truest form, is not about possession. It is about participation in the flow of life. And to participate fully, you must first face the parts of yourself that pleasure kept hidden. This is why so few talk about the shock. It's not flattering. It doesn't sell the fantasy of enlightenment. The shock exposes how fragile our inner structures are, how dependent we've become on distraction to maintain our sense of identity. But only by enduring that exposure do we discover what lies beyond fragility. Because once you have faced the trembling silence within you and survived it, you realize that nothing outside of you truly controls you anymore. You start to live differently. You no longer chase experiences to feel alive. You bring life into every experience. You stop confusing stimulation with meaning. You understand that sexual energy was never just about the act. It was about awakening the totality of your being. The shock teaches you that aliveness is not something to be pursued, but something to be remembered. So when that silence arrives, when the pleasure fades and the restlessness rises, don't turn away. That's not emptiness calling. That's life knocking on the door of your awareness, demanding to be felt without disguise. The discomfort you feel is not your enemy. It's your awakening in disguise. Stand in that shock. Let it cleanse you of illusions. Let it show you how much power you've been giving away for a moment's comfort. Because once you face the silence within and learn to breathe in it, you will discover that you were never empty. You were overflowing, but you had forgotten where to look. ChatGPT said, when you commit to abstinence, something profound begins to stir in the depths of your psyche. It is not simply a matter of holding back physical desire. It is a journey into the shadowed regions of your own mind. Most people live their lives skimming the surface of consciousness, constantly occupied with distraction, comfort, and indulgence. Sexual pleasure, like other compulsions, has been one of the most effective tools for keeping the deeper self asleep. But when you stop feeding it, the shadow, the part of yourself you rarely acknowledge, begins to rise, demanding recognition. This shadow is not evil, though it often feels frightening. It is raw, unrefined energy, the part of you that has been denied expression, and therefore has grown wild in the darkness. It is in these depths that your instincts, your fears, your unspoken longings, and your untamed creativity reside. When sexual energy is constantly spent outwardly, the shadow is anesthetized. But abstinence removes the anesthetic, and suddenly the shadow is vivid, insistent, unavoidable. You see parts of yourself that you had carefully ignored, your selfishness, your cravings, your insecurities, your projections onto others. The initial reaction is often denial or fear. You may feel that something inside you is dangerous, that the impulses arising from this shadow are unacceptable, and in many ways that fear is justified, because the shadow does not conform to social expectation, polite manners, or moral comfort. But here lies the critical turning point. The shadow is not to be destroyed or rejected. It is to be confronted, acknowledged, and integrated. Abstinence forces you to meet the shadow directly, because the usual outlet for your energy is closed. Every impulse, every temptation, every surge of desire that once found satisfaction now asks for your attention. You can no longer ignore the restless currents within your own psyche. And in this confrontation, you discover the raw truth. The shadow contains not only chaos but also power. It holds the very energy that can be transformed into creativity, insight, and profound vitality. The psychological work of abstinence is, therefore, deeply alchemical. What you experience as discomfort or even torment is in fact the shadow attempting to guide your transformation. The impulses you feel are messages, not enemies. They are expressions of the parts of yourself that have been denied recognition, seeking a conscious channel. If you respond unconsciously, if you give in to the old patterns of gratification, the shadow retreats back into darkness, leaving you fragmented, restless, and unaware of your own potency. But if you respond consciously, you begin a process of integration. You learn to honor your instincts without being enslaved by them. You begin to reclaim the energy that once scattered itself in fleeting pleasures and redirect it into your growth and creativity. Abstinence also illuminates the ways in which sexual desire is tied to the psyche's compensatory mechanisms. Often what we think of as sexual longing is, in fact, a signal from the unconscious that something essential is missing in our lives: authenticity, connection, or self-recognition. The more you abstain, the more these signals become impossible to ignore. You begin to see how you have used desire as a diversion from facing the parts of yourself that demand attention. And in this seeing there is liberation. You realize that the energy once bound in compulsive expression can now fuel deeper insight, stronger presence, and richer creativity. The shadow is also deeply philosophical in nature. It challenges the comfortable illusions that structure our lives. It asks hard questions. What do you truly want? What are you hiding from yourself? What parts of your being have been neglected or denied? It reveals that life is not merely a pursuit of pleasure, but a complex negotiation with your own inner depths. Sexual energy, when withheld, exposes the interplay between instinct and consciousness. It forces you to confront the tension between the immediate gratification demanded by the body and the enduring growth promised by awareness. This confrontation is not painless. It is, in fact, the shock that most avoid, and the reason why few speak of abstinence in its psychological truth. You feel waves of intensity, restlessness, and sometimes even aggression. These are not failures. They are the shadow asserting its presence, reminding you that unexamined parts of the psyche do not disappear. They accumulate and they demand recognition. You are being asked to witness yourself fully, without defense, without distraction. And when you do, you find that the shadow once feared becomes a source of strength. Integration occurs when you learn to dance with your shadow rather than fight it, You acknowledge the desire, the longing, the raw impulses, without being compelled to act upon them. You allow the energy to circulate inward, refining itself into awareness, insight, and creative power. Over time, the shadow's chaotic force becomes a reservoir of vitality. You discover depth, resilience, and clarity that cannot be achieved through indulgence alone. Sexual abstinence, therefore, is not about denying life. It is about learning to harness life's most powerful currents. Ultimately, confronting the shadow through abstinence is an invitation to wholeness. It teaches you that the parts of yourself you have feared are not enemies but guides. It shows that the energy once expended in fleeting satisfaction can, when observed and directed, fuel extraordinary personal growth. The journey is challenging because it requires courage, patience, and self-honesty. But the reward is profound. A psyche no longer fragmented, a consciousness awakened, and an inner power reclaimed. So when the shadow rises, and it will, you do not turn away. You face it, observe it, and channel its energy. In this confrontation lies the essence of transformation. The unseen forces within you are not to be feared. They are to be mastered, integrated, and liberated. Abstinence is the mirror that forces you to look, and in that reflection, you discover not emptiness, but a reservoir of life waiting to be awakened. When we speak of sexual abstinence, it is tempting to frame it as a simple act of denial. Yet at its deepest level, abstinence is not deprivation, it is alchemy. The energy that once flowed outward, seeking release, begins to turn inward, and in doing so it transforms. Sexual energy, in its rawest form, is one of the most potent forces within the human psyche. It is instinctual, primal, and intensely alive. When released habitually, it gratifies momentarily, leaving the deeper self untouched. But when consciously withheld, it begins a subtle, profound transmutation. It seeks new channels of expression, refining itself into higher forms of awareness, creativity, and power. This process is not metaphorical, it is deeply psychological. Human desire is fundamentally a drive toward vitality, toward life, toward integration. When sexual energy is constantly dissipated through indulgence, it strengthens the body's immediate gratification systems, but leaves the psyche fragmented. By withholding it, you interrupt this habitual cycle, and the energy that once fed outward impulses now begins to circulate inward. At first, this is uncomfortable. Restlessness rises, thoughts become intense, and old fantasies return with unusual force. But this discomfort is the very signal of alchemy in motion. The psyche is beginning to reorient, transforming instinct into consciousness. The first step of this alchemy is awareness. Sexual energy, when no longer allowed immediate release, presses against the edges of consciousness. It becomes impossible to ignore. You begin to notice subtleties in your mind and body that were once masked by distraction. You sense the undercurrents of desire not as mere impulses, but as messages. What is this energy asking for? What aspect of the self does it seek to awaken or integrate? Here the philosophical dimension emerges. Sexual energy is not simply a bodily function, it is a mirror of the soul's vitality. It seeks expression, yes, but not only in the external world, it seeks to illuminate the interior. From this recognition, the process of sublimation begins. Sublimation is the redirection of instinctual energy toward higher purposes. The intensity that once demanded physical satisfaction can now fuel thought, imagination, and creation. The writer who wrestles with ideas, the artist who channels emotion into form, the thinker who seeks clarity, all are engaging in some form in this same alchemical process. Abstinence magnifies this potential because the energy is concentrated and conscious. It is no longer diffused in habitual indulgence, but deliberately directed toward acts of creation and transformation. Psychologically, this is revolutionary. Human beings often confuse the satisfaction of desire with fulfillment. Sexual release is fleeting. It gratifies the body, but rarely nourishes the soul. When you abstain, the same energy that once demanded immediate satisfaction becomes a lens into your inner world. You begin to perceive patterns of thought, hidden emotions, and unrealized potential. The alchemy is subtle but persistent. You are learning to convert impulse into insight, desire into clarity, and restlessness into vision. Philosophically, the implications are profound. The instinctual life that drives sexual desire is not base or sinful. It is life force itself. Every culture that explored spiritual or psychological depth recognized that this energy, when transformed, becomes the foundation of wisdom, creativity, and self-mastery. The same current that drives physical longing can also fuel artistic innovation, intellectual breakthrough, or spiritual insight. The challenge and the opportunity of abstinence is to confront the energy, endure the tension, and guide it into conscious, meaningful channels. The alchemy of desire also teaches patience and self-mastery. When the body demands release and the mind resists distraction, you are forced to cultivate awareness, discipline, and reflection. These qualities are not incidental. They are the byproducts of transformation. The energy, once contained and observed, strengthens the will, sharpens perception, and heightens emotional intelligence. You discover that the currents of desire, once thought to enslave, can in fact liberate when held consciously. Yet the process is not linear. There are moments of doubt, moments when the intensity feels unbearable, moments when the old habits beckon with seductive familiarity. This is the crucible of transformation. The alchemical process does not occur in comfort. It occurs in tension. It occurs when you stand at the edge of instinct and consciousness, when you resist the pull of immediate gratification and allow energy to rise within you. In that rising, the raw primal force of sexuality begins to illuminate the psyche. It reveals what is alive, what is dormant, and what is capable of creation beyond the body. Through this conscious transmutation, the individual discovers a depth of vitality that cannot be attained through habitual indulgence. You begin to operate from a place of concentrated energy rather than scattered impulse. Your presence becomes more magnetic, your thinking more precise, your creativity more potent. You realize that the sexual energy you once believed was only about pleasure was always about life itself, the life of mind, body and soul converging in conscious expression. Abstinence, therefore, is not mere restraint. It is alchemical practice. It is the art of converting instinct into consciousness, desire into power, and restlessness into clarity. It teaches that energy is never wasted. It is only misdirected. By holding, observing, and guiding it, you can achieve an extraordinary transformation that touches every dimension of your being. The ultimate insight of this process is simple yet profound. The same fire that once consumed you in fleeting gratification can, when consciously directed, illuminate the totality of your existence. Sexual energy is not a limitation to be controlled. It is a force to be mastered, refined, and awakened. The alchemy is within your reach, but it requires courage, patience, and the willingness to confront the intensity of your own life. When one truly engages with abstinence, the final revelation is perhaps the most profound. The realization of your own sovereignty over your inner life. It is a shock, yes, but not the shock of sudden deprivation. It is the shock of encountering the full force of your own being, unmediated by distraction, indulgence, or habitual escape. Sexual energy, when consciously withheld, becomes a mirror, reflecting not only what you desire but who you are. And what you see can be both exhilarating and terrifying. Most people live as if desire is something external, something to be fulfilled, conquered, or subdued. But abstinence teaches that desire is neither external nor simply bodily. It is intrinsic, a vital signal from the unconscious, calling for conscious engagement. In the initial stages, the intensity can feel destabilizing. The body's longing, the mind's restless imaginings, the heart's yearning, all converge, creating a turbulence that can seem unmanageable. This is the psychological storm that most people are unprepared to face, the very shock that is seldom discussed. It is not weakness to feel this. On the contrary, it is the inevitable encounter with the raw, undirected life force that pulses through every human being. By avoiding this confrontation, one remains fragmented, dependent upon fleeting pleasures and external affirmations. By facing it, one begins the work of true self-mastery. Sovereignty over desire is not about repression. Repression is an attempt to bury the energy, to deny its existence, and it produces nothing but fragmentation, shame, and unconscious influence. Sovereignty is mastery. It is the conscious channeling of energy, in a way that strengthens rather than diminishes the self. As sexual energy is held, its intensity forces attention inward. You begin to perceive subtle dynamics within yourself, the interplay between instinct and thought, between longing and awareness, between unconscious impulse and conscious choice. Every surge of desire becomes a teacher, every moment of tension a doorway to insight. Philosophically, this is radical. Humanity has long been captivated by the notion that we are at the mercy of our desires, that pleasure dictates behavior and instinct defines destiny. Abstinence reveals the opposite, that the human being is capable of turning instinct into wisdom, passion into clarity, and desire into creative power. It is a subtle shift, yet it is transformative. The energy that once enslaved you becomes your ally. You are no longer reactive. You are intentional. You are no longer scattered. You are focused. And in that focus, something extraordinary emerges, a sense of presence, of integration, of self-possession that cannot be achieved through indulgence. This process also illuminates the nature of relationships, intimacy, and connection. When desire is constantly gratified, it can obscure authentic connection. Habitual indulgence often substitutes for true engagement, masking the deeper human need for recognition, respect, and emotional resonance. Through abstinence, the psyche begins to discern between transient pleasure and enduring fulfillment. You notice what has been unconscious, the ways you have sought affirmation in others, the ways you have projected your inner turbulence onto external sources, the patterns of attachment and dependence that shaped your interactions. Sexual energy, held consciously, becomes a lens through which you examine not only yourself, but the dynamics of connection with others. The philosophical depth of this practice cannot be overstated. It teaches that life itself is a series of choices between immediate gratification and enduring growth. Sexual energy is the most intimate expression of this tension because it is both instinctual and profoundly symbolic. By abstaining, by consciously redirecting this energy, you learn a principle applicable to every sphere of existence. That energy, once recognized and mastered, can be transformed into insight, creativity, and authentic power. The external world may offer distractions, temptations, and easy gratifications, but sovereignty is always found inward. In the conscious management of one's own inner life, at its deepest level, abstinence becomes a philosophical and psychological practice of self-realization. The energy that once sought release now seeks understanding. The desire that once dominated your attention now demands discernment. You are forced to confront uncomfortable truths about yourself, your dependencies, your illusions, your projections, and your fears. Yet this confrontation is also liberating. When you meet desire without immediately succumbing, you reclaim your agency. You reclaim the life force that has always been yours. You discover that you are not a passive passenger in your own existence, but the active architect of your consciousness. In this final stage, the shock transforms into insight. The restlessness, the intensity, the turbulence, all become markers of vitality, indicators that life itself is calling you to awaken. You realize that the absence of gratification is not emptiness but presence. You realize that energy, when held consciously, amplifies perception, sharpens creativity, and deepens emotional intelligence. You realize that sexual energy, far from being merely physical, is a microcosm of the totality of life. Instinct, consciousness, emotion, and spirit converging in a single force. This insight carries with it a profound call to action. Life's vitality is not something to be squandered in habitual indulgence. It is a current to be understood, guided, and transformed. The mastery of desire is not asceticism for its own sake. It is the cultivation of clarity, the reclaiming of power, and the awakening of the self. It teaches patience, discernment, courage, and presence. And in this mastery, one discovers the true meaning of freedom. Not the freedom to indulge, but the freedom to act consciously, to live deliberately, and to harness the most potent forces within oneself for creation, connection, and growth. The ultimate lesson of abstinence, when fully embraced, is sovereignty. You learn that desire is not a master but a messenger, that energy is not something to be lost but a force to be refined, and that the psyche, once confronted in its entirety, holds infinite potential. This is the shock that few speak of, that you are far more alive, far more capable, and far more powerful than you ever imagined, but only if you are willing to face yourself without compromise. The life you have been seeking outside yourself has always been inside. Master the energy within. and the world outside begins to transform.